I used to think American Special Forces were the quietest operators in Vietnam. We had May CV SOG running deep recon into Laos and Cambodia. We had long-range reconnaissance patrols vanishing into triple canopy jungle for weeks at a time. We had Navy SEALs conducting riverine operations that left no witnesses. These were the ghosts of the war, the shadows that moved through enemy territory and came back with intelligence that shaped entire campaigns. People whispered their names with a mixture of fear and reverence, and I believed it, until the day I watched 5 Australians operate in Puak Tui province and realized we'd been doing reconnaissance wrong the entire time. This is the story of a weapon so effective that the Viet Cong gave it a name that still echoes through military history. They called them Ma Rung, phantoms of the jungle. It wasn't a rifle, it wasn't a piece of technology. It wasn't even a tactic in the traditional sense. It was something far more fundamental, far more devastating, and far more difficult to replicate. It was a philosophy so alien to American military doctrine that even when we saw it work, even when we tried to learn from it, most of us never truly understood what made it so lethal. The weapon was silence, not just the absence of noise, but the absence of presence itself. And the Australian Special Air Service Regiment had mastered it in ways that would change how special operations forces around the world thought about reconnaissance forever. The birth of a different kind of warrior. To understand what made the Australian SAS so uniquely effective in Vietnam, you have to go back to 1957 to a small compound in Perth, Western Australia, where a unit of just 180 men was formed under the command of Major W. Gook. They called themselves the 1st Special Air Service Company, modeled after the British SAS, but destined to become something entirely their own. From the very beginning, they were the ugly duckling of the Australian Army, too small to be taken seriously, too specialized to fit into traditional military doctrine, too unconventional to be understood by commanders who still thought of warfare in terms of battalion-sized maneuvers and overwhelming firepower. But in February 1965, when 1st Squadron deployed to Borneo during the Indonesian confrontation, everything changed. The British SAS had already been operating there since 1963, living for months at a time in small jungle forward operating bases with limited resupply, conducting covert cross-border operations against Indonesian communist forces. The environment was unforgiving. Dense triple canopy jungle where visibility dropped to mere meters, heat and humidity that could break a man's will before the enemy ever found him, terrain so hostile that the first Australian SAS soldier to die on active service wasn't killed by enemy action, but gored to death by a rogue elephant, suffering for days in the jungle with a wound that no amount of training could have prepared him for. But it was in this crucible that the Australian SAS learned something the British had already discovered. In jungle warfare, the loudest force doesn't win. The fastest force doesn't win. The force with the most firepower doesn't necessarily win. The force that isn't there at all, that moves like smoke through the trees, that sees without being seen, that knows without being known, that force owns the battlefield in ways traditional military thinking couldn't comprehend. During 5 months in Borneo, 1st Squadron mounted 50 patrols, 23 reconnaissance missions, 7 reconnaissance ambush operations, 4 pure surveillance tasks, 13 hearts and minds patrols designed to win over local villagers. Some patrols lasted 2 days. Others stretched to 89 days of continuous operations in enemy territory. And in that time, They developed a skill set that would prove absolutely devastating when applied to Vietnam. They learned how to track enemy movement through the subtlest disturbances in the jungle. They learned how to lay ambushes so perfectly concealed that Indonesian forces would walk within meters without detecting them. They learned how to defeat the enemy at his own game, on his own terrain. Most importantly, they learned that patience, silence, and invisibility were not just tactics, but a way of being. The Borneo experience taught them to live in the jungle, not just operate through it, to become part of the ecosystem rather than an invading presence, to move at the pace of nature rather than the pace of military objectives. When their tour ended and they rotated back to Australia, they carried with them hard-won knowledge that would soon be tested in an even more unforgiving theater of war. Navedemiam, a different war entirely. In June 1966, 3rd Squadron of the Australian SAS arrived at Nui Dat in Puok Tui Province, one of the first Australian units on the ground, as part of the escalating commitment to prevent Communist North Vietnam from overrunning the South. They operated out of an area of the Australian Task Force headquarters called SAS Hill, a secure location so restricted that no other Australian or Allied forces were permitted entry. Only Australian SAS personnel could pass through those perimeters. The secrecy wasn't bravado, it was operational necessity. The nature of their work demanded total compartmentalization. Their role was simple in concept, devastatingly difficult in execution. They were to be the eyes and ears of 1st Australian Task Force, 5-man patrols operating throughout Phuoc Tuy Province and beyond into Bien Hoa, Long Khan, and Binh Tuy provinces. Each patrol consisted of a lead scout, patrol leader, second-in-command, signaller, and medic. These weren't just job titles, they were positions of absolute trust. The teams remained together for the duration of their tours, bonding to the point where they could anticipate each other's movements, read each other's intentions through the smallest gesture, operate as a single organism rather than 5 separate men. Pre-deployment training in Papua New Guinea had been designed specifically to create this cohesion. Operators didn't just learn jungle skills and acclimatize to tropical environments. They learned each other. They learned to become so familiar with their teammates' idiosyncrasies, capabilities, and thought processes that they could move through enemy territory in near-perfect synchronization without verbal communication. This wasn't just team building, it was the foundation of their entire operational philosophy. Their weapons selection was eclectic and pragmatic. M16 rifles and CAR-15 carbines, self-loading rifles, M79 grenade launchers, sometimes mounted beneath M16 as M203, silenced Sterling submachine guns, mysteriously purchased from the United Kingdom, their suppressors turning deadly weapons into whispers in the jungle. General purpose, machine guns, Bren guns, combat shotguns, a wide variety of pistols, claymore mines, grenades of every description. They chose their loadouts based on mission requirements, not regulation. If it worked, they used it. If it didn't, they left it behind. Each weapon was selected for a specific purpose and stripped of anything unnecessary. Soldiers would file down sharp edges that might catch on vegetation. They would wrap metal components in cloth to prevent the distinctive clink that could give away a position. They would test every piece of equipment for noise, for reflection, for any characteristic that might betray their presence. A buckle that squeaked would be replaced. A snap that clicked would be taped over. A zipper that caught would be removed entirely and replaced with buttons wrapped in fabric. This obsessive attention to detail extended to their uniforms, which were often a mixture of Australian issue greens, American issue greens for their superior drying ability and larger pockets, and Vietnamese tiger stripe camouflage patterns that broke up their silhouettes more effectively in the jungle. But the real weapons, the ones that made them phantoms, weren't made of metal and gunpowder. The philosophy of absence. Between 1966 and 1971, each of 3 Australian SAS Sabre squadrons completed 2 tours in Vietnam. They conducted nearly 1,200 patrols. They observed the movements of over 5,600 enemy troops. They engaged in 298 contacts with the enemy. Their final tally was staggering: 492 confirmed enemy killed, 106 possibly killed, 47 wounded, 10 possibly wounded, 11 prisoners captured. Their own losses? 1 killed in action, 1 died of wounds, 3 accidentally killed, 1 missing, later presumed dead, 1 death from illness, 28 wounded. These numbers tell a story that goes far beyond combat effectiveness. They reveal a fundamental difference in operational philosophy. The Australian SAS had developed what one Viet Cong commander later described as the most terrifying capability in the entire war. As a female former member of the Viet Cong explained decades later in a documentary interview, "We were not afraid of the American GIs, Australian infantry, or even B-52 bombing. We hated the Australian SAS Rangers because they make comrades disappear. Disappear, not killed in firefights, not captured in raids. They simply vanished. One day, a Viet Cong soldier would be on patrol. The next day, he would be gone, with no sound, no witness, no explanation. The psychological impact of this was profound. American forces inspired fear through firepower and mobility. The Australian SAS inspired something deeper, a primal uncertainty, the knowledge that you could be watched, tracked, and eliminated without ever knowing they were there. This wasn't accidental. It was the culmination of a doctrine built around reconnaissance rather than direct action. As Major Reginald Beasley, commander of 3rd Squadron during its second tour, famously stated when he kicked down the kill boards erected by previous squadrons, "We were not there to kill people, but to gain information." This wasn't squeamishness or hesitation. It was strategic clarity. Dead enemies make noise. They trigger responses. They create complications. Intelligence gathered silently. Without the enemy knowing you were ever there, that was worth more than any body count. The Australian SAS patrol methodology reflected this philosophy in every detail. A standard patrol area covered 4 map grid squares, with one designated as a safety grid for emergency extraction. But within those boundaries, the Australians moved with a deliberation that baffled American observers. Where U.S. long-range reconnaissance patrols might plan for a rate of movement of 1 kilometer per hour, Australian SAS patrols sometimes moved at just 100 meters per hour, not because they were slower or less capable, but because they were doing something fundamentally different. They weren't trying to cover ground. They were trying to understand it. Every tree, every rock, every slope of earth became a navigation point. The patrol leader would glance at natural features and adjust course by a few degrees, with no word spoken, no confirmation needed. The rest of the team followed without hesitation, as if tethered by an invisible thread. When they stopped, they all stopped instantly. No staggered halts, no domino effect of men catching up. One froze, all froze. American forces who observed this coordination were mystified. How could 5 men move in such perfect synchronization without radio communications, without hand signals, without any visible coordination mechanism? The answer lay in their preparation. Every scenario had been walked through before they stepped into the jungle. Every contingency had been rehearsed until it became muscle memory. They didn't need to communicate during operations because they had already communicated everything that mattered during training. This pre-mission rehearsal was exhaustive in ways that went far beyond typical American patrol preparation. Australian SAS teams would spend days walking through mock-ups of their target areas, practicing movement sequences until each man could anticipate exactly where his teammates would be at any given moment. They rehearsed immediate action drills for ambushes, for chance encounters with enemy patrols, for equipment failures, for injuries. They practiced these scenarios in daylight, in darkness, in rain, in different types of terrain. By the time they inserted into the actual area of operations, they had already lived through the mission dozens of times. The jungle was just confirming what their muscles already knew: the technology of invisibility. While American Special Operations Forces relied heavily on technology, radios, encrypted communications, PRC-25 radios with backup batteries, signal mirrors, the Australian SAS stripped their operations to absolute essentials. They carried minimal gear, no visible radios in many cases, no constant check-ins with base. When American observers asked about their communications procedures, one Australian signaller simply patted a folded message card in his chest pouch. "If we don't come back," he said flatly, "someone will find this. If they don't need to." This wasn't fatalism, it was preparation. They didn't plan to be rescued. They planned not to be found in the first place. Their coordination came from repetition, from shared instinct, from a kind of drilled-in cohesion that was alien to most American units. American forces trained hard and trusted their gear. The Australians trained until they could execute entire missions, blind, deaf, and mute, and still be exactly where they needed to be. This extended to their fieldcraft in ways that went beyond anything American forces practiced. When establishing observation posts near enemy trails, the Australians didn't just set up at a safe distance. They crawled down so close to the trail that observers could read the markings on rice sacks being transported, count the bullets in bandoliers, memorize faces, note the wear patterns on boots. One Australian operator burrowed under a rotted log, lying perfectly still with only his eyes visible through a layer of wet leaves, so close to passing NVA soldiers that he could hear their conversations, smell their cigarettes, watch sweat drip from their faces onto the trail beneath his position. When the time came to exfiltrate, they didn't just withdraw carefully. They erased themselves. They walked on routes to avoid leaving footprints. They crawled over rocks to prevent disturbing vegetation. They moved through creek beds where water would wash away any trace of their passage. Every resting point was cleaned. Every pressure mark in the mud was covered. Even their spit was buried. When American forces later tried to backtrack Australian patrol routes, they often couldn't find where the Australians had set up, even when they knew the general location. As one Australian operator explained, "If they find your trail, they'll follow it, so we leave none." The American learning curve. The U.S. military's relationship with the Australian SAS was complex. On one hand, there was immediate recognition of their effectiveness. Australian SAS personnel provided instructors to the May CV Recondo School at Nha Trang, starting in September 1966. The Recondo School concept had actually originated in Australia, and the Australians passed those principles to American forces. Later, They would teach at the LRRP Training Wing at the AATTV-operated Van Keep Training Center. Some Australian SAS members even served on exchange with MADV SOG units, the most elite American Special Operations Force in Vietnam. American long-range reconnaissance patrol personnel from units like the 101st Airborne Division would often accompany Australian SAS patrols to learn their techniques. What they observed challenged fundamental assumptions about how reconnaissance should be conducted. American doctrine emphasized speed and firepower. Get in fast, gather intelligence, extract undercover of supporting arms if compromised. The Australians demonstrated that there was another way. Get in slowly, become invisible, gather intelligence so thoroughly that the enemy never knows you were there. Walk out the same way you came in. Some American units absorbed these lessons more thoroughly than others. Teams that spent extended periods working alongside Australian patrols began to modify their own procedures. They started packing lighter, stripping away the extra batteries, the backup communications gear, the comfort items that added weight and bulk. They began moving slower, taking more time to observe before crossing danger areas. They started practicing extended stillness drills, training their bodies to remain motionless for hours at a time. They learned to control their breathing, to slow their heart rates, to become part of the environment rather than visitors passing through it. These adaptations didn't come easily. They required unlearning ingrained habits and embracing a patience that ran counter to American military temperament. The differences were stark and sometimes uncomfortable for American forces to acknowledge. U.S. Special Operations units were among the best-trained forces in the world. MADV SOG operators conducted some of the most dangerous missions of the entire war, operating deep in Laos and Cambodia, often outnumbered hundreds to one, calling in airstrikes and extractions under fire. These were not inadequate soldiers, but they operated within a different paradigm, an American paradigm that valued action, aggression, and the application of overwhelming force when necessary. The Australian paradigm valued restraint. It valued patience. It valued the intelligence gathered without engagement over the enemy killed in contact. When American forces conducted ambushes, the goal was to inflict maximum casualties and break contact. When Australian forces conducted ambushes, the goal was often simply to observe, to count, to memorize, and to report. The enemy was allowed to pass unmolested, completely unaware that 5 men lay within meters of their position, cataloging every detail of their equipment, their morale, their direction of travel, their probable destination. This difference in approach extended to how they measured success. American forces often measured success in kills, in body counts, in enemy infrastructure destroyed. The Australian SAS measured success in what they saw, what they avoided, what they learned without being noticed. A successful Australian patrol might return with no enemy contact whatsoever, but with intelligence so detailed and accurate that it enabled larger Australian and American forces to plan operations with unprecedented precision. One American officer who observed Australian SAS operations noted, "They don't avoid firefights because they're afraid. They avoid them because they don't need them. The enemy can't fight what it doesn't know is there." This was a profound shift in thinking for many American commanders who had been trained to seek out and destroy the enemy, not to observe and evade. The weapon revealed. So what was the secret weapon? It wasn't superior technology. The Australians often operated with less sophisticated equipment than their American counterparts. It wasn't superior training in the traditional sense. American Special Operations Forces underwent some of the most rigorous training regimens in the world. It wasn't even superior tactics, though their tactical approach was certainly effective. The secret weapon was a philosophical commitment to invisibility as the primary operational objective. Everything else, weapon selection, patrol size, movement techniques, communications procedures, mission planning, exfiltration routes, everything flowed from this single principle. The Australian SAS didn't just try to be quiet. They tried not to exist. They designed their presence so perfectly that they left no scent, no sound, no trail, no reason for the enemy to look twice. This required a level of discipline that went beyond what most military units could achieve or even understand. It meant moving at 1/10 the speed you were capable of, because slower movement meant quieter movement. It meant lying motionless for hours in positions so uncomfortable that every muscle screamed for relief. It meant watching enemy forces pass within arm's reach and doing nothing, gathering intelligence instead of engaging, trusting that the information you collected would be more valuable than any damage you could inflict. It meant training until you could communicate through the subtlest shifts of weight, the briefest glance, a finger moved along a rifle barrel, a blink held 1 second too long. It meant rehearsing every possible scenario before deployment so thoroughly that when you encountered it in the field, your response was automatic, silent, coordinated. It meant accepting that if something went catastrophically wrong, rescue might not come, because rescue operations made noise, left traces, compromised the very invisibility that kept you alive. American forces who tried to adopt Australian SAS techniques often struggled not because they lacked the physical capability, but because the philosophy was so alien to American military culture. American doctrine was built on firepower, mobility, technology, and the assumption that American forces could outfight any enemy in any environment. The Australian doctrine was built on patience, invisibility, restraint, and the assumption that the best fight was the one that never happened. The long shadow of the phantoms, the Australian SAS legacy in Vietnam, extends far beyond their impressive kill ratio, which was the highest of any unit in the war relative to their size and casualties. It extends beyond the 1,200 patrols they conducted or the intelligence they gathered. Their real legacy was demonstrating that there was an alternative to the American way of war, at least in the context of special reconnaissance operations. After the war, when special operations forces around the world began to seriously study what worked and what didn't in Vietnam, the Australian SAS model became increasingly influential. The idea that silence and invisibility could be more powerful than firepower, that patience could be more effective than speed, that restraint could be more strategic than aggression, these concepts began to permeate special operations doctrine globally. The Viet Cong's name for them, Ma Rung, Phantoms of the Jungle, captured something essential about what made them so effective. They had become something that existed in the liminal space between presence and absence. They were there, gathering intelligence, tracking movements, shaping the battlefield through information rather than bullets. But they might as well have been ghosts for all the trace they left behind. One American MACV SOG operator later reflected, "We thought we were the best. We thought we were ghosts. Then we saw the ones who didn't need to be seen to win, and we never looked at the jungle the same way again." This wasn't an admission of defeat. It was recognition that excellence takes many forms, and sometimes the quietest form is the most devastating. The doctrine of disappearance. Understanding the Australian SAS weapon requires understanding the environment that shaped it. Vietnam was not a conventional war. There were no front lines in the traditional sense. The enemy could be anywhere. A farmer working a rice paddy by day might be a Viet Cong soldier by night. Supply routes ran through neutral countries that were officially off-limits. Intelligence was often more valuable than territory, because territory meant nothing if you didn't know where the enemy was or where he was going. In this environment, the ability to move unseen and gather information without alerting the enemy became paramount. The Australian SAS refined this capability to an extraordinary degree. They studied the jungle the way a scholar studies ancient texts, learning to read meaning in the subtlest details. A vine bent in a particular direction indicated passage. Disturbed moss on a tree trunk revealed a handhold. The flight pattern of birds could signal human presence. The smell of the air could tell you if someone had recently passed through an area. They learned to mask their own signatures with equal precision. Scent discipline became an obsession. No soap, no deodorant, no cigarettes, nothing that would carry an unnatural smell into the jungle. They rubbed mud on exposed skin, not just for camouflage, but to cover their scent. They moved downwind of suspected enemy positions. They buried their waste deep enough that no smell would rise to the surface. They were silent even in their bodily functions. Their camouflage went beyond just wearing the right colors. They studied how light filtered through the jungle canopy at different times of day and positioned themselves in shadows. They used natural vegetation to break up their silhouettes, not just placing branches on their backs, but integrating themselves into the visual texture of the environment. An Australian operator in a hide position could be 3 meters from an enemy soldier and remain completely invisible if he had chosen his position correctly. This level of fieldcraft required constant practice and absolute commitment. There were no shortcuts. You couldn't achieve this level of invisibility through technology alone. It demanded a mindset where every action, every movement, every breath was calculated for its impact on your signature. It required thinking like terrain rather than thinking like a soldier. Why America couldn't replicate it. The question that haunted American Special Operations planners after observing the Australian SAS was why, despite having access to their training methods, despite hosting their instructors, despite conducting joint operations, American forces couldn't quite achieve the same level of effectiveness. The answer is complex and rooted in fundamental differences between Australian and American military culture. American military doctrine has always emphasized overwhelming force, rapid decision-making, and aggressive action. These are not weaknesses. In many contexts, they are exactly what's needed. American forces excel at missions requiring speed, firepower, and the ability to escalate violence faster than the enemy can respond. The American way of war has proven devastatingly effective in countless conflicts, but the Australian SAS capability required something different. It required accepting that sometimes the best military response is to do nothing, to watch and wait, to gather information rather than engage, to measure success not in enemies killed, but in intelligence collected. This ran counter to deeply ingrained American military instincts. Additionally, American forces operated under different constraints. They had more resources available, which paradoxically made them less disciplined about what they carried. An American patrol could call for helicopter extraction, could request gunship support, could radio for artillery fire. These capabilities were lifelines that kept American soldiers alive in countless situations, but they also became dependencies. The knowledge that help was a radio call away subtly changed how patrols operated. The Australian SAS, operating with more limited resources and often at greater distances from support, couldn't afford such dependencies. They had to be self-sufficient to a degree that forced them to be more careful, more patient, more invisible. Their limitations became their strengths. There was also a difference in how the two forces were integrated into larger military operations. American Special Operations Forces often worked directly in support of conventional operations, which meant their missions had to align with broader campaign timelines and objectives. The Australian SAS, operating as part of a smaller overall Australian commitment, had more operational independence. They could spend days or weeks on a single observation mission without pressure to produce immediate results. The continuing legacy, when the Australian SAS finally withdrew from Vietnam in October 1971, they left behind a combat record that would be studied for decades. But more than that, they left behind a proven alternative model for how special reconnaissance could be conducted. The idea that silence, patience, and invisibility could be not just tactics, but an entire operational philosophy took root in special operations communities around the world. The impact on subsequent special operations doctrine was profound and far-reaching. Military planners began to recognize that different mission types required fundamentally different approaches. Not every reconnaissance mission needed to be conducted with the assumption that extraction would require gunship support. Not every intelligence-gathering operation needed to prioritize speed over stealth. The Australian model demonstrated that there was value in the slow, patient, invisible approach that prioritized information over action. Training programs for special reconnaissance units began to incorporate Australian-inspired techniques, extended fieldcraft training, emphasis on movement discipline, patience drills where operators would remain motionless in hide positions for days at a time, practice in reading terrain for intelligence rather than just for tactical advantage. These weren't revolutionary concepts in themselves, but the systematic integration of them into a cohesive operational philosophy represented a significant shift from earlier doctrine. Modern special operations forces, including American units, have incorporated many Australian SAS principles into their doctrine. The emphasis on small team operations, the value placed on intelligence gathering over direct action in certain contexts, the recognition that sometimes the mission is to observe rather than engage. These are all lessons that trace back in part to what the Australian SAS demonstrated in Vietnam. But the full philosophy, the complete commitment to invisibility as the primary operational objective, remains difficult to fully implement within most military structures. It requires a level of operational independence, a willingness to measure success in unconventional ways, and a cultural acceptance of restraint that doesn't come naturally to most military organizations, especially those operating at scale. The secret weapon of the Australian SAS wasn't secret in the sense that no one knew about it. American forces observed it, studied it, tried to learn from it, but it was secret in the deeper sense that knowing about it and truly understanding it were two different things. You could watch an Australian patrol move through the jungle, could see their techniques, could even try to replicate their methods, but unless you internalize the philosophy behind those methods, unless you transformed your entire approach to reconnaissance from action-oriented to absence-oriented, you would only ever achieve a pale imitation of what made them phantoms. The final truth, in the end, the secret weapon of the Australian SAS was the understanding that in certain types of warfare, the greatest power belongs not to those who can strike hardest, but to those who can see without being seen, know without being known, operate without being detected. They proved that a 5-man patrol moving at 100 meters per hour, carrying minimal equipment, leaving no trace, could achieve results that entire battalions with overwhelming firepower could not. They showed that excellence in special operations isn't always loud. Sometimes it's invisible. They demonstrated that the absence of presence, the achievement of tactical non-existence while still accomplishing the mission, represented a form of military capability that was every bit as valid and often more effective than the application of violence. The Viet Cong called them Ma Rung, phantoms of the jungle, and the name was more accurate than perhaps even they realized. The Australian SAS had achieved something remarkable. They had become warriors who won not by fighting, but by not being there at all. They had mastered the art of military action through military absence, and in doing so, they had created a legend that would influence special operations thinking for generations to come. The weapon wasn't in their hands, it was in their absence, and that made it the most devastating weapon of all.